delighted to have Simon Tyler joining us this morning. Simon has spent the last 20 years working in remote regions of the world with MSF. He began life as a conservation biologist and then moved into the humanitarian sector and project and mission management with MSF. He has worked in places such as South Sudan, Pakistan, Nigeria, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Myanmar, to name a few. He's going to tell us more about those different places later. And more recently, he has headed up the COVID response for all MSF operations in the UK and now works for the Indian office remotely on an internal management review project. So Simon, it's so good to have you with us. Thank you for joining this morning.
Yes, thank you, Shamma. Good morning. It's good to be here.
So as I mentioned earlier, we will be talking about building mental resilience this morning. And for anyone who has joined us just logged on now, I encourage you to put any questions you have into the Q&A box. We'll come on to those later on once we've had a bit of a discussion. So please do just be adding those as they come to you. But Simon, to begin with, can you just tell us about what you're doing now and your previous missions?
Yes, of course, Shamma. Yeah. Maybe I go back to when I started with MSF in the mid 2000s. We started at the bottom, regardless of your previous experience, because there's a lot to learn. It's a new sector to work in. I came from an environmental research sector where I was leading remote wildlife expeditions in places like Borneo and the Philippines and Congo, working with primates and bats and birds and large volunteer groups. And I moved into this sector and found myself having to start at the bottom in Darfur, of all places, having to run 2 remote field hospitals with nothing more than a roll of sticky tape and a penknife, really. I mean, it really was basic times. You were left to your own devices, but people had a lot of trust in you. I learned a lot. We certainly provided a huge resource to that region. And obviously after that, my first mission, I moved through late 2000s into more logistical roles, senior logistical roles, into large scale projects. South Sudan at the time was one of the largest interventions, probably in the humanitarian sector in that period. Before, well, in between civil wars, let's face it. MSF at the time, we had numerous large field hospitals inside South Sudan, a lot of them run from a supply hub in northern Kenya. So the whole idea of remote mission management, huge hospitals. I mean, we're talking, 700,000-800,000 consultations a year between these facilities. Put it into context, that's probably, it's probably about 5% of the whole of the UK outpatient patient load. So you can see the volume of patients we used to see, and we were the only resource in these remote locations. I then shifted from logistical management into more project coordination and project management, and then spent a couple of years in Pakistan, up on the Afghan border, in Balochistan and in Quetta, places both heartlands for Afghan Taliban, highly remote and highly insecure regions. So I had a very, very different type of management and security management that was thrust on myself. So a little bit of a real experience working in these regions. I then returned to South Sudan for another mission as I was a little bit more experienced, and I went off to run one of these very large field hospitals, often cut off for 6-7 weeks at a time during wet season. So you can imagine our medical stores were huge, to try and ensure we had enough stock to see us through wet season. But of course, what it did mean, people couldn't get in or out for long periods of time. We were relying on aircraft, and when it rains, the mud airstrip just floods out. So, and a lot of that hasn't changed today. Even now, it still remains the same. It hasn't really moved on. It's such a shame after independence in a country which has so many natural resources. It has the potential, but clearly it hasn't quite been realized yet. I then moved into the more senior management roles as head of mission. Basically, you are the responsible senior manager for all MSF operations in that country. I started in Myanmar, in Burma, with a focus on some of the HIV programs we started in very remote places, on the kind of excluded groups, and then moved into emergency coordination and emergency management in Rakhine State. Now, obviously, everybody's very aware of the Rohingya population and the movement of them about 3 years ago from Myanmar to Bangladesh, but it has been a decade-long problem. One that MSF had been close to since our arrival in Myanmar about 20 years ago. So I was heading up the emergency operations, running 27 remote clinic locations throughout Rakhine State, serving a mainly Rohingya population because they had no access to medical care throughout the country. They were denied access by a lot of the state authorities. We moved on through this. I returned to Pakistan. So it's a place that's in a region that's quite close to my heart. I went back as the head of mission and provided senior mission management and humanitarian steer for our 3 hospitals in Balochistan, but based in Islamabad. So I had a very different oversight of the workings of the humanitarian sector, frequently engaging with senior government officials, liaising with the UN at certain coordination forums, and actually then being also the lead manager in emergency response. I think an earthquake occurred close by when we were there, and then I was the one to head up those type of responses. So in fitting with the insecure environments, I thought I'd take a break. I went to North Syria for best part of 8 or 9 months. There's a few interesting tales to tell, which I'll share later. But Syria was a really interesting mission, as you can imagine. We were based in 3 hubs, one in Turkey, one in Kurdistan, Iraq, and one in Syria. We can explain a little bit later how that all worked, because it's quite an interesting story, how to adapt and overcome certain problems. I then moved into Iraq after Syria, did a spell there as head of mission, and then also down into Jordan. Now, Jordan itself obviously has a huge refugee population, but also at the time it was access into South Syria. So I've actually had access to both parts of the Syria conflict. More recently, though, I stepped out of the field in the last year, 18 months, and used some of my experience to help the UK office set up recruitment hubs in Jordan and Tunisia. This is mainly for medical professionals who are wishing to work in places such as Pakistan and Syria. I also provided a bit of support as their interim head of the program unit, which is an external facing team based in the UK, engaging in government, think tanks, presentations, external representation, etc. You tend to be outside of the general director. You tend to be the voice of MSF in the UK in representing all parliamentary groups and raising general concerns that we see from the field. And as typical MSF, we try to highlight where things need to be done. And then more recently, closer to home, as the COVID pandemic took hold, there was a need not only in our locations where we work in refugee camps, but clearly in home societies. So I was asked to coordinate the MSF UK COVID response, which lasted for about 3.5 months during the height of the peak of the mortality rates and the infections during late March, April and May. We teamed up with University College London Hospital and Thames Reach, who is a homeless charity. And we ran a small hotel providing medical care for homeless, COVID positive homeless people in East London, which is highly successful, a great partnership. And I hope that they're going to use this model to take forward. And then in the last 2 months, I've been supporting the India office remotely, of course. I'm not in India at the moment. On more institutional management, on how they can become a stronger voice within the whole movement of MSF. MSF obviously having a lot of very strong European hubs. There is a strong desire and a need to try and rebalance this a little bit. So I'm working with their team in India to try and hopefully elevate their status and their voice from the region towards the movement. So that's what I'll be starting work on in about an hour's time. India are 4.5 hours ahead of me, so my inbox is full. So
amazing. Well, we'll come on to all of those different places and projects you've worked with in a bit. To begin with, I mean, this topic, which I've mentioned already, is about building mental resilience. And Simon, what does that mean to you in the different contexts that you've worked in?
I think can I best summarize it? As the senior manager, people take a lead from you as well. You dictate the atmosphere, the pace, the response. And one of the key issues I find, because especially, we're dealing with very different types of crises, is a tendency to remain calm. If I remain calm, others will feel so. They'll take that confident lead. They'll feel reassured. There's many ways and tools that I have to ensure that we can do that. And one of those was, of course, to ensure that everybody who arrived knew what we do in case of certain crisis situations. I mean, we do have to take this level of preparedness. Bunkers are built in hospitals to allow for safe, someone to remove themselves from any sort of conflict should it arise. People need to be comfortable with this. So if I display an outward demeanor of remaining calm in that crisis, and the only way I can do that is if I'm comfortable with the plans that we put in place. I also feel that I need to remain humble as well at certain times to enable me to remain calm, and that often means accepting advice from all others at all times. It may mean that often teams within the field are mainly international field staff. Sometimes you have to recognize the best way of overcoming these problems is actually relying on your local, your national staff team. Sometimes it's the only way. But in a few words, mental resilience, it means remaining calm in that crisis. And the only way I can do that is often by having a thorough preparedness, allowing me to feel confident and then allowing my team to feel confident.
And in addition to that preparedness, what are the other ingredients to building mental resilience? You've obviously been in unstable situations where it's unpredictable and anything could happen, and you're going to tell us more about that in a bit. But what are those other aspects that are important alongside being prepared?
Well, I think the need to be flexible is quite important. No, actually, it's vital. When planning, we plan for all scenarios. Which allows us to operate like this. We have a specific plan where all types of incidents can be identified, and then we provide a response, a detailed response plan for each. And then we make sure that we have enough supplies and staff to respond for, say, 2 or 3 days for each scenario, which really does allow us to, 1, respond where the crisis hits, but 2, know what we're doing, and know how to do it. But there's always something that comes up which is out of the box, always. And I'll refer to Syria in 2016. Our base in Turkey was used to access North Syria. A couple of clinics, hospitals, supplies, and staff were passing freely between Turkey and North Syria. And then actually, literally on my arrival, as the Syrian Defense Force, obviously with the US support, was moving across northern Syria, displacing Islamic State, Daesh, from the region, the borders closed because the Turks recognized the Kurds as terrorists, so therefore they shut the border. So within the space of a few days, we lost complete access to all our staff teams, our clinics, our medical supplies, our resupply links. Everything was closed within the space. It was just shut. We got a big problem. And interestingly, there's not many options. Of course, you can start to put medicines in jiffy bags and float them down the river, try all sorts of crazy, wonderful ideas. But at the end, we do need to get people in. We need to get doctors in. We need to get medical supplies, most importantly. That's the number one thing we need to get in, and also need to fund it somehow. So the solution, and I wouldn't quite say it was innovated at all, but we were probably the only one at the time who was doing it. Meant from our base in Turkey, we had to take a 2-hour flight to Kurdistan, Iraq, northern Iraq. We then took a 4-hour car journey to the border. We then met with the officials. We took our vehicles across a pontoon bridge, and then we had about an 8-hour journey across the top of North Syria to resupply our project. If you put this into context, it was about a 30-minute to 45-minute, car drive before across the border. Now all of a sudden it becomes a huge scale operation, and means that we need to establish hubs in different places to support it. We then put a new hub in Kurdistan, in Erbil. We then start to put them in northeast Syria, in Hasaka and places such as that. So it was we needed to remain super flexible. We needed to examine all options, but also we didn't close our bases in Turkey because we never knew when that option might present itself again. We kept a small footprint there. So it became a very complex intervention to manage. But, and of course, when you show people on the map what you had to do to resupply your clinic, it became, wow, it seems crazy on paper. But of course, it also presents serious security concerns. And that's the other thing as well, because of course, traveling across the top of North Syria 4 years ago, it was not a particularly safe thing to do. So of course, that's when your own networks, the people that, the contacts we had, we tried to analyze as much as we could. And a lot of it was done really through our own networks. It couldn't necessarily be done through official channels until ultimately I and my manager were comfortable and happy that we could provide the security necessary to run that team through. So very, very unique situation, very unique.
Another situation that you've told me about previously was the situation when you were working in Myanmar, and how there was that situation as well that needed you to adapt. So could you tell us a bit about that one as well?
Yes, there's there was. I mean, it's emergency response at its finest in a way. It's 7 years ago. The word comes through at 3:30 in the afternoon that the Rohingya at the time had all been displaced into camps, isolated parts of town. They were treated like prisoners, to be honest with you, after the violence of 2012. So everything that's happened we see now, there's a long history of this. And so a lot of the offshore islands had camps that were built. A lot of them were built out of natural materials, out of bamboo. But of course, when you've got huge concentrations of people on very small these islands, maybe huge longhouses, and everybody's burning and cooking inside these longhouses, there's an accident waiting to happen. So literally at 3:30 in the afternoon, the word came in from one of my colleagues at the UN saying, there's been a fire in one of the longhouses. We haven't got a clue on casualties. We don't know what's needed. We have got no idea, but this sounds serious. And this was really a good example on how we could respond immediately. Within 30 minutes, the core team in Sitwe town in Rakhine had met. I'd asked what resources we had available to deploy, and by 8 o'clock the next morning, a large boat left the docks with a team of a mobile medical team, mainly tents to support that mobile clinic, and also some what we call non-food items, the blankets, the cooking pots, the things the basics that people use in life, because of course they could have lost everything just for distribution. And we look back on that and thought, wow, this took literally just over 12 hours. And the reason there was a delay is because, of course, it was night and we couldn't put the boat in the water. But it was really quite reassuring to know that that we can be as responsive as this in all of these emergency situations. Yeah, and I think as well it goes back to the point that everybody knew what they were doing. We didn't need to sit down and brief someone. They'd been pre-briefed. They knew the structure of that mobile clinic. They knew who was going to be manage the flow of patients, who was going to do the consultation, who was going to do the distribution. They all knew this well in advance. So it just became a very, very rapid response when it was needed.
Yeah, it's like you said earlier, the thinking of every single scenario and planning for it and really being prepared for anything that could happen is it's amazing what you achieved there. Coming back to the story you told us about Syria, I think the remarkable thing there is that, you know, how many different hubs you were managing and organizing and coordinating that response. How does collaboration come into this adapting to a crisis and responding? How does that fit in?
I think it's the best way for me to define collaboration and kind of like coordination, should we say, is to look at it from two ways. Within MSF, I'll call the internal coordination, not necessarily within our own teams, but of course, MSF is a very large organization, and it could be that there could be similar programs set up 200 kilometers away, you know, supporting a different type of intervention. They may be responsible for vaccination. They may be doing mother and child health. They may be doing nutrition, where we are doing, you know, emergency pediatric care. It could be a little bit like that. So there is always a combination of different MSF programs within the country, often run by different European hubs. We link together routinely. We're in contact daily. So there's this internal coordination structure and collaboration whereby if somebody needs 4 Land Cruisers, you know, and, you know, I don't know, half a ton of therapeutic food, and we have it, it goes the next day. It's fine. It works perfectly well. But this is very easy in a way. It's internal. It's that collaboration. External, there are always a few systems set up in countries, mainly headed up by the UN, whereby, yes, we will need to feed into, shall we say. Now, that ensures that, you know, interventions and responses not duplicated. The UN will also know who is responsible for certain areas on certain themes, and they'll meet on a regular basis. There was one instance where I even joined on phone once on Skype in the days when the pre-Zoom and Skype days in a way, to a meeting that was being held in Erbil on Mosul evacuation. I happened to be in Syria at the time, and even on Skype, I could promise the UN response said, "There's people leaving Erbil. They're coming into Syria. They're freezing cold." Said, "I have 5,000. We have 5,000 blankets. We'll put them in a truck tomorrow, and we'll send them to that camp. And then, therefore, they can wait in tents with some warmth. There's something we can do." But it needed to be fed often through that coordination hub, that collaborative, that structure. Otherwise, we could not operate in isolation alone. One, we would miss so many things. Two, we'd probably duplicate what we're doing with others. Sometimes it needs a more independent thought. And out of these, sometimes you actually have a strong partnership, shall we say, or coordination structure informally with other health actors. You know, that's the other one. You know, you will bring in the likes of the International Rescue Committee, International Committee for the Red Cross, you know, Action Against Hunger, MSF. These very similar organizations come together in a very informal way. And that's basically how we work. But of course, none of this can really be possible without having very strong links and ties to local health authorities and governments. Because let's face it, there's no way any of this can ever happen without coordinating through their structures when they exist, of course. Because let's face it, in certain parts of Syria, these did not exist.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just take a second to pause here and encourage everyone listening to please do be adding your questions into the Q&A box. If you've joined us a bit later, that's the box at the bottom of your screen. It think it just says Q&A, so it should be fairly self-explanatory. But you can add questions in there, add your name if you feel comfortable with that. Otherwise, you can just leave that. But please do be adding your questions, and we'll come on to those in a bit. Simon, one of the things that really strike me about the stories you've been telling us is how quickly things happen. And you've already talked about how preparation and everyone being briefed allows that to just happen and things to roll immediately. I guess one thing you mentioned earlier was about the importance of decision making as a leader as well. So what makes a good decision making process?
I mean, I kind of felt that, I mean, rather than go through the structures of the formal structures of a decision-making process, because often, you know, you need to react a lot of the time, I mean, within MSF, there was only really one decision that I took on my shoulders alone, and that was the security-related decisions. You know, I alone took that, often with support from my manager, because ultimately, you know, that's what you're there to do. It's security management. It's those movements across Syria. Can they or can't they go? You know, I have that network and contact, and I can make that call. People aren't happy, then they don't have to go. But of the decision-making processes, this is one that often sat with the senior manager or one or two people. Everything else, we love to talk about it. And that's the thing about MSF. They used to say we often were like meetings without borders. We often had so many consultation within our teams. It was over certain issues. It enabled everybody to have to buy into the final decision, shall we say? I mean, one instance in Pakistan, we had literally a couple of 70 metric tons, I think it was, of therapeutic food sitting in a dock awaiting clearance for 6 months because of we'd used a red pen instead of a blue pen or something. You know, there was some small administrative error which restricted this getting into the country, and it was one of the biggest feeding programs that we were running. You know, it was huge. There was literally 1,000 children a day were enrolling on the program. A month. Every month, 1,000 children enrolling, malnourished children, and we're running low on supplies. So you know, again, I wasn't going to take the decision on my own because we needed to release a lot of money to pay for the tax and duty to get that out. And it brought a lot of discussion in the mission. Everybody had differing opinions. But the one I deferred to most was I organized a core team of senior Pashtun and Baloch and Pakistani staff who could sit and actually share how they felt about it. Because, come on, I may be the senior manager in the mission, but I'm often not best placed to make those decisions. So it was recognizing who was best placed to advise. And that team often was that local team, that experienced team. And they were the ones I went to when making certain decisions to ensure that we weren't doing anything stupid. And I think it was also realizing, yes, I may be seen as the senior manager, I may be the head of mission, but the reality is very different. I do need to ensure that the teams are happy and comfortable with the direction we're taking. They have been consulted, and I'm not too proud to ask for advice, especially from some very junior staff, but ultimately who have experience beyond mine. So I think it was very important to recognize that from an early stage. You know?
Well, thank you, Simon, for sharing that. I think we've got some questions coming in, so I'll move us on to that now. And I think from these questions, it looks like there'll be more opportunities for you to share stories from those different places you've worked in. So, first question here. Is how much does it play on your mind when operating in areas where there are groups who don't comply with international laws and norms, and how do you mentally deal with the uncertainty that this creates?
Are we talking about? I guess we're talking about the when they don't conform to the norms. We're talking about opposition groups in conflict areas, or I guess that's yeah, rather, because I mean, I was thinking maybe some international NGOs might not be conforming, but that's not where I'm going. Yeah, it's a really it's a tricky one. I can't really divulge in the conversations that I have, but as you can imagine, it's not our place to. We're not political. Yeah, we're not taking sides. So I'm treating every contact as an equal. Doesn't matter what they do necessarily. If they come into the hospital, they leave their gun at the door. They're a patient. End of story. Doesn't matter what they've done. Now that's the front line. Behind that, we do need to think a little bit deeply if there's going to be problems sometimes. But that's the position we present. That allows us to do what we do. Our whole security and our management is based on acceptance. And to get that acceptance, these groups that we mentioned that don't conform, we will try and have a dialogue with. You know, we'll try and share, this is what we do. This is how we do it. We are not here to shop you to the authorities. You know, we are here to support anybody who doesn't have access to healthcare. We could provide that, you know, in certain cases. So it does mean, yes, we do communicate with all sides of or we try to communicate with all sides on a conflict area. And I have to say, there's only one time, and you can read into this how you want, when I wasn't able to do this, and that was in North Syria, for obvious reasons. All other conflict areas I worked in, we've managed to have access to at least engage and say, look, we're going here, we're going there, that's what we're doing. We can't really have an opinion necessarily. Yes, it's not great, but ultimately, yeah, we need to provide the support we do. We talk to all sides. Obviously, there are some striking examples in Darfur in the 2000s, of course, when we used to witness such atrocities, and then when we have witnessed these type of things, then that becomes the time to say something. This is what that takes MSF to a different place, I feel, is because when we've actually witnessed something, then it's real, and then we can actually start to advocate for the victims and also other systems. So yeah, we need to engage, we need to talk, but also when we witness something, we will also raise our voice, as we have done frequently in the past.
We have another question that's just come in from Richard. Thank you, Richard, for this. And he's asking, what procedures do you have to help identify those members of your team who are struggling with mental resilience in a certain country?
And obviously, I'm not an expert on this type of thing, but what we do have is we do have access to, and obviously confidential access to a psychosocial unit at all levels. I've used it on frequent occasions. I've been stuck in Darfur, for instance, with no passport, waiting to get home, not knowing what's going on. I think I just need to talk to someone. I need to just reach out and go, you know, just say, what can I do? How can I do this? Now that provides the psychological support from psychologists, from professionals, from mental health experts who've worked in this field and who can actually just listen and help. There's also other ways, something that the organization has installed in the last 5 or so years, probably a bit longer, is often for lesser experienced staff, they may be appointed a mentor as well. Now, I've been a mentor for about 4 or 5 years now for new senior field managers and project staff. So I don't get in the way of the operational line. That's not my place. I can't start to give proactive advice to do this and do that. I can share my experiences. I can actually, they can have someone outside of that management structure that they can go to, and they can just let off steam, and then they can come away from it feeling like, okay, I've spoken to Simon, he's done this before, I'm not being silly, or they can build a little bit of their own confidence as well. So we have a couple of really, we provided them as an externals. Let's face it, the mental health Often support lines come from international hotlines, which are available 24 hours. Mentor programs for some of our newly qualified staff allow them also to build that resilience. Because of course you can imagine within the structure of an incredibly fast-paced response, sometimes we miss things, and we have to be honest, of course we do, because our eyes are always fixed on that population of people who need our assistance. Now that's our common goal. So sometimes we miss things. So when we do, we try and bring in an external to the mission, but internal with an MSF support structure for people to lean on.
That's so important, isn't it? I think we have time for one final question before we close. We have a question here which is asking, what do you think the future is for global healthcare?
Well, this is a hard one. It's the notion of global healthcare has probably only really realistically come to the fore with this pandemic. I mean, when Ebola happened, it wasn't a Western problem. We shut our eyes to it a lot of the time, and I feel in a way it should have been treated a little bit differently, and it should have been recognised. And some of the greatest killers on this planet don't even touch the Western borders, shall we say, the high-income countries, so we have no concept of it, which is a real shame. And of course, the biggest issue I feel at the moment is until I'm advocating here really, until prices of medicine can be made affordable in these countries, and it's out of the hands of the big pharmaceuticals who make money, then we'll continue to have a problem. We can say what we like, we can do what we like, but ultimately there's a need for access to medicines. And people shouldn't be paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a treatment when they earn $1 a month. I think we completely missed the point. And it's hard to talk about global healthcare in that when knowing this type of thing. So I think we have a lot of things to put right. I've been in conferences with large pharmaceuticals where I've voiced opinions, and I also know MSF continues to do so and will continue to do so. To the people who can't afford it. So in a way, it becomes a truly global healthcare problem when we treat it as a global health concern. So.
Well, Simon, thank you so much for joining. We're sadly out of time, but it's been wonderful to hear all of your stories and sharing them, because they're really quite amazing, and it's great to hear about your work. So thank you for joining us. It's been great to hear.